In this video, we are going to discuss elastic collision, inelastic collision, and the differences between them. Let us first start with elastic collision. A collision is said to be elastic whenever the objects that collide with each other rebound after the collision. So let's take an example. If you have two balls that are moving towards each other, I will call this ball 1 and 2. They collide with each other, and after the collision, they move away. They bounce back from each other, they rebound from each other, or they are separated from each other. This kind of collision is called elastic collision. So it doesn't matter in what direction initially both the balls were moving. As long as after the collision they separate from each other, this kind of collision is called elastic collision. So initially they could be coming towards each other, or they could both be moving in the same direction, but as long as after the collision they separate from each other, they rebound from each other, this kind of collision is described as elastic collision. There are two important properties for elastic collision. First, in case of elastic collision, total momentum is always conserved. That means it follows the law of conservation of momentum. Now, what is the law of conservation of momentum? Law of conservation of momentum says that sum of the final momentum vector must be exactly equal to sum of the initial momentum vector. So if my particles here had initial momentum values as P1 initial and P2 initial, law of conservation of momentum says that sum of this initial value of momentum must be exactly equal to sum of the final value of momentum. That means P1 final plus P2 final must be equal to P1 initial plus P2 initial. Momentum before collision must be equal to momentum after collision. So this is one of the important property of elastic collision. Another important thing is total kinetic energy is also conserved. So sum of kinetic energy before collision must be equal to sum of kinetic energy after the collision. So these are the three important things about elastic collision. Whenever you need to determine if collision is elastic or not, you must look at these three things. The first thing is they must separate from each other after collision. They must rebound from each other. Second are these two properties that the total momentum must be conserved and total kinetic energy must be conserved. These are the three important things you must look for when you are determining if the collision is elastic or inelastic. Next comes inelastic collision. In case of inelastic collision, when two bodies collide with each other, they stick to each other after the collision. So if I have two objects, one and two, when they collide with each other, after the collision, these two bodies move together as one. So this is after the collision. They stick to each other after the collision. This kind of collision is called inelastic collision. Whenever two objects after collision stick to each other, this kind of collision is called inelastic collision. An example of inelastic collision could be if you take a clay and you throw that clay to a wall, you know the clay will stick to the wall. Whereas if this collision was elastic, elastic collision can be taken with the example of a ball. If I throw a ball at the wall, it will bounce back. The ball will bounce back from the wall, whereas the clay, it will stick to the wall. So clay is an example of inelastic collision. When I throw the clay to the wall, it's an example of inelastic collision. Whereas the ball here is an example of elastic collision because it will bounce back from the wall. Important properties about inelastic collisions are first, again, total momentum is conserved. Remember, both elastic and inelastic collision must follow the law of conservation of momentum. Momentum is conserved regardless of what kind of collision it is. It is conserved in both elastic and inelastic. The difference here is kinetic energy is not conserved. All of my initial kinetic energy, sum of my initial kinetic energy is not equal to sum of my final kinetic energy. Some of this kinetic energy is lost into other form of energy. It could be converted to thermal energy or sound energy. So there are two main differences between elastic collision and inelastic collision. First, in case of inelastic collision, the two objects stick to each other after collision, whereas in case of elastic, they are separated from each other. So this is the first difference, that they stick to each other. Second difference, in case of inelastic collision, kinetic energy is not conserved. For elastic, this was conserved. So this is the second point of difference. You need to know the differences between these two kind of collision because they can ask you questions in exam. You can be asked question that goes like this. So here the question says, which of the following statement is or true for elastic collision? This is for elastic collision. So let's look at the statements here. First option says total linear momentum is conserved, which is true. It is true for elastic collision. Total kinetic energy of the system is conserved, which is also true for elastic collision. Then it says the colliding object move as one after collision. Now, this doesn't happen in case of elastic. This happens in case of inelastic collision, that the two objects move as one after collision. So this is not true. Only option A and B are true for elastic, that both linear momentum and kinetic energy are conserved. Sometimes they can combine these two terms together and just write that total linear momentum and kinetic energy is conserved. If the same question asked about inelastic collision, if in place of elastic collision, the same question asked about inelastic collision, then you could say that the first statement is true for inelastic because total momentum must be conserved in both cases. And the second statement is not true for inelastic. And the third statement is true for inelastic. Because we know in inelastic collision, the object stick to each other after collision. So if this question was asked for inelastic collision instead of elastic, I will write my answer as A and C.